Hi, this is Bill Spalding. I recently did a video on the 30-year TIPS and why I think it will be one of the best investments for 2023. I also mentioned in that video that I thought August would be the best time to buy rather than February. Now that August has arrived, I still believe this is the best time to buy. Now the question is whether it would be better to buy in August or February 2024. If you want to learn more details about TIPS, check out my other video on TIPS, which provides more basic information. A link is provided in the description below. The main advantages of TIPS is that they are free of state and local income taxes. They have a large potential for capital gains, and they have very little interest rate risk when interest rates are already high. They also have no credit risk. While news of government shutdowns or potential defaults pop up from time to time, the government cannot afford to default on its debt because it would greatly increase interest rates, requiring an increase in taxes, which nobody wants. TIPS also provide an excellent hedge against inflation, which may become more significant in the future if the government debt is not managed more successfully. TIPS are issued only in electronic format, with maturity terms of 5, 10, or 30 years. As a hedge against inflation, the principal of TIPS is adjusted according to the Consumer Price Index. Interest is paid every 6 months. The interest amount is determined by the principal, adjusted for inflation, multiplied by the interest rate, which is fixed for the life of the bond. At maturity, the greater of the adjusted principal or the original par value is paid. The coupon rate for TIPS is low compared to other treasuries because much of the return is in the form of principal adjustments. A primary advantage of TIPS is that they offer a real rate that will not change over the life of the bond, while the nominal rate for treasury notes and bonds could drop below the inflation rate, resulting in less purchasing power. To compare the yields of TIPS to treasuries, you must consider the inflation rate plus the real yield. The nominal yield of most bonds and other treasuries consists of a real yield plus a portion of the yield that compensates for inflation. The total return of TIPS equals the coupon interest rate plus the principal adjustment according to inflation. The break-even inflation rate is the rate of inflation that equalizes the total return of TIPS with other treasuries or other bonds with coupons paying a nominal yield. The fixed interest rate is determined by auction. Duration measures the sensitivity of the market price of a bond to changes in interest rates. Duration is the weighted average maturity time of all payments. Graphically, the duration of a bond can be envisioned as a fulcrum placed under a seesaw so as to balance the weights of the present values of the coupon payments and the principal payment. Both a longer term maturity and a lower coupon rate results in a longer duration. A longer duration means that a security could be sold for a higher capital gain when interest rates decline. Although duration is a useful measure, the duration of TIPS cannot be measured. Duration depends on future cash flows, and because both the interest payments and the principal payment depend on the adjustments to principal, which, in turn, depend on future inflation, there is no way to measure the duration of TIPS. Nonetheless, it is certain that the duration is long, since the term of the bond is 30 years, and most of the cash flow occurs at maturity. This table illustrates the potential for capital gains. Because future cash flows for TIPS is unknowable, I displayed what the theoretical prices would be for the 30-year Treasury bond when interest rates decline from 5% to 0.25%. As you can see here, if interest rates decline to 1% or less, then you will have a capital gain exceeding 100%. This could happen within a few years. How long would it take for the stock market to double? Because the duration of 30 years TIPS is even longer, the price should increase even more when interest rates decline. But even an interest rate decline of only 2 or 3% can result in capital gains of 40% to 67%. TIPS are not subject to state or local income taxes, but they are subject to annual federal taxes on both the semi-annual coupon payments and the adjustments to principal. The tax and adjustments to principal is often referred to as phantom income because you must pay the tax annually even though the principal adjustments are not received until the security is sold or matures. Therefore, it is best to hold TIPS in tax-advantaged retirement accounts. This summarizes how taxable income is calculated. You should receive Form 1099 OID from your custodian, showing the amount of interest paid in Box 2 and adjustments to principal in Box 8. Although it is not necessary, some custodians may choose to report the annual payment of interest separately. If interest payments are not reported on Form 1099 OID, then the interest income is reported on Form 1099 INT in Box 3. You can add the coupon rate to the inflation rate to get an approximate value of the annual increase in your return. As you can see in this example for a 5-year TIPS, the total return is slightly less than the coupon rate plus inflation rate, compounded annually for 5 years. Now I will briefly show why the 30-year TIPS is better than I-bonds. The new fixed rate for I-bonds is 0.9%, making the annualized composite rate equal to 4.3%, which includes the variable portion. The coupon rate for TIPS issued in August will be 1.5%. Although the coupon rate is fixed for 30 years, interest payments increase as the adjusted principal increases. So the investment return equals the adjusted principal plus the coupon payments. The main investment benefit of TIPS over I-bonds is that the real interest rate is 1.5% for TIPS and 0.9% for I-bonds. TIPS also have a tremendous capital gain potential, while I-bonds can only be redeemed by the federal government for face value. Using the CPI inflation calculator, I calculated that the average inflation rate has been 3.7% over the past 30 years. One reason why the fixed rate of I-bonds is not directly comparable to the coupon rate of TIPS is because the interest in I-bonds is compounded semi-annually, whereas the interest earned from TIPS is paid out semi-annually, so it is not compounded. But the interest payments of TIPS increase as the principal is adjusted with inflation. So using the published interest rates of these two securities, based on the 3.7% annual inflation rate of the past 30 years, I calculated the total return for both types of securities. As you can see here, over the 30-year term of these securities, TIPS returned a profit of 366% compared to 293% of the total profit for I-bonds. Clearly, TIPS provide a larger investment return over I-bonds, just in terms of the interest paid plus the inflation adjustments. However, as I said earlier, TIPS also provide a much greater potential for capital gains, gains which can easily exceed that of the stock market, whereas the potential capital gains of I-bonds is zero, because I-bonds cannot be resold. They can only be redeemed by the government. Both securities are free of credit default risk, and they are not subject to state or local taxes. One thing you should note is that the taxation of I-bonds and TIPS differ. With I-bonds, you do not have to pay taxes until the bond is redeemed or until it matures. Another advantage of I-bonds is that if the interest is used to pay for qualified educational expenses, then the interest is tax-free. A big disadvantage of TIPS is that taxes are due both on the semi-annual interest payments and the adjustments to principal, so it is best to hold TIPS in a tax-advantaged retirement account. This is the auction schedule for Treasury inflation-protected securities, showing the auctions for original issues and for reopenings. Reopenings are simply another sale of a previously issued security, having the same maturity date and coupon interest rate as the original issue, but with a different issue date and purchase price. Higher interest rates in August means that the price for the August issue will be discounted from par value. It will have the same coupon rate, but the price will be lower, so the yield to maturity will be higher. If you buy a bond and pay a price different from par value, then there will be a gain or loss when the bond matures, when you receive the par value of the bond. Yield to maturity incorporates this gain or loss. The formula for yield to maturity is rather complicated, but it's easier to understand how the market price affects the yield to maturity. If you pay less than par value, then the yield to maturity will exceed the nominal yield, because you will have an additional gain on the principal. If you pay more than par value, then the yield to maturity will be less than the nominal yield, because you will have a loss on the principal. Because you may be able to buy TIPS at a discount in August, the yield to maturity will be higher than the coupon rate. Here, you can see the auction results for the reopening in August 2022. Note that the coupon rate is 0.125%, or 1/8 of 1%, the same rate as the February original issue. However, since interest rates have risen dramatically between the February original issue and the August reopening, the TIPS were sold at a substantial discount, more than 15%, giving this issue a yield to maturity that better matched the higher interest rates current at that time. This table shows the two 30-year TIPS that were sold in 2022, showing the lower price for the August issue. Interest rates are slightly higher now than they were in February, so you should be able to buy it at discount. Prices have also declined because many investors are worried about the increasing government debt, and also because the government needs to sell a lot of treasuries to pay for the increasing cost of government and the higher interest rate on the debt, thus increasing supply, which reduces treasury prices. As you can see in this graph of 10-year treasuries, interest rates are as high as they've been over the past year, which means their prices are lower. So you may be able to buy the 30-year TIPS at a bigger discount than what would be expected by only considering higher interest rates. But remember, the exact discount will depend on the auction. Now, let's go over the details of the August calendar for the 30-year TIPS. The auction will take place on August 24th. The issue date is the 31st. The dated date is the 15th of the month. This is an important date because it is the date when interest starts accruing, and the reference CPI index for this date will serve as the base for determining principal adjustments, which will also determine the amount of interest earned. When you buy TIPS, you must also pay for the accrued interest plus the accrued principal from the dated date to the issue date. You will get the payment for accrued interest back with the first interest payment, but you will only get the accrued principal back either when you sell the bond in the secondary market or at maturity. You can buy TIPS either at Treasury Direct or through your broker. When buying TIPS at Treasury Direct, you can only buy new issues through auctions. You can buy before the announcement, and you can buy in multiples of $100 rather than the $1,000 most brokers require. However, to sell in the secondary marketplace, you must transfer the securities to a broker. Buying TIPS at a broker makes it easier to sell. You can also buy TIPS for your retirement account, which would allow you to avoid the annual taxes. However, the minimum purchase is usually $1,000, and purchases must be in multiples of $1,000. Brokers only provide the option to buy newly issued TIPS for the 1 week between the announcement date and the auction date, so you should mark your calendar to remind yourself of the upcoming dates if you wish to buy. So, should you buy in August or wait until February 2024? That is your decision. Another increase of 0.25% is possible, but most economists think it is unlikely to go much higher than that. Many people believe that interest rates are already at a peak. The problem with waiting until 2024 is that there may be good signs that the Fed will pivot and start decreasing interest rates. This may cause bond prices to go higher on the news, even before actual interest rate decreases. I don't think it will make much of a difference, so I would not fret about it too much. You could also buy at both auctions. Either issue should increase substantially in price when interest rates decline, and you will earn a nice risk-free return while you hold. The future price of TIPS will also depend on future inflation. If inflation is high, then prices will also be high. Although inflation in the past has typically been around 2%, which is the Federal Reserve's preferred rate, it will probably be higher in the future because there will be some need to pay off the enormous federal debt, especially when politicians are reluctant to raise taxes. Moreover, because of that debt, if another crisis occurs, such as another pandemic, then the federal government will have no choice but to print more money, since raising taxes then would be calamitous. And when calamities occur, TIPS will also benefit from the flight to quality, when people minimize risk by selling risky securities, then using the proceeds to buy safe securities. U.S. Treasuries are the safest haven, so they benefit the most from the flight to quality. So here's a summary of the advantages of buying 30-year TIPS. No credit default risk, exemption from state and local taxes, and interest and principal steadily increase. You can profit from decreasing interest rates from the flight to quality during economic turmoil, and you have the potential to earn substantial capital gains, possibly even doubling your money within a short time. Or hold to lock in a decent interest rate and protection against inflation for 30 years. Thank you very much for your time. If you liked my video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. I would appreciate any suggestions, so please leave them in the comments below. Check out my website at thismatter.com for more than 850 in-depth fundamental tutorials in personal finance, investments, and economics. Check out my books on money at williamspalding.com. Thank you.